Hey everybody, good to see you. Thank you for coming. It's great to be back. I was here in 2010 when my first book, Herding Donkeys, came out, and now I am back here for this new book, Us the Ballot, and this is a place that I just really love. I love coming here. I'm glad it's sunny and warm out today, and I love Skip, and I love the work that everyone's doing, and it was great to meet a lot of the students and hear from them, and it rekindled some of the idealism that I may have lost as a journalist over the last decade. And so I just want to talk about the history of the Voting Rights Act and also what is happening today. And one of the coolest things in researching this book and looking at the history of voting rights since 1965 was being able to spend time with people like Congressman John Lewis and to be able to tell their stories. And Congressman Lewis often talks about his time in the civil rights movement and says that he was guided by the spirit of history. Now, I was too young to personally experience all of that history. I was born in 1982, the peak of Reagan years, unfortunately. But I was able to retrace so many of these steps with Congressman Lewis and others. And I traveled twice with him on civil rights pilgrimages to Alabama with many members of Congress. And we observed the 50th anniversary of the integration of the University of Alabama. We observed the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham church bombing. We observed the anniversaries of the Freedom Rides in Montgomery. And we observed the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama this past March, when 100,000 people were there, including President Obama and John Lewis. And my book begins with that scene of President Obama and John Lewis in Selma. And it was an extraordinary thing to witness, and for me, I was lucky because this was the last moment that I could update my book before it went to the publisher, and I was lucky to get it in there for it to be the opening. So I want to do a quick reading of that to set up the story and then talk to you about what has happened since. 50 years after he nearly died in the most important march in American civil rights history, Congressman John Lewis returned to Selma, Alabama on March 7, 2015. Hail to the Chief played as Lewis followed President Barack Obama and former President George W. Bush across Water Avenue in downtown Selma to a podium at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a former Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. 100 members of Congress who accompanied Lewis on this civil rights pilgrimage sat nearby on the blindingly sunny afternoon. A few Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, held signs that read, "Voting rights are civil rights." Lucy Baines Johnson, the daughter of the former President Lyndon Johnson, sat a few feet away from Peggy Wallace Kennedy, the daughter of the former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Their fathers had fought on opposite sides of the battle for civil rights. Behind the dignitaries, 60,000 people, some from as far away as South Africa, had converged on Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March. It was the largest crowd the small city of 20,000 has ever seen. This city, on the banks of the Alabama River, gave birth to a movement that changed America forever, Lewis said. Our country will never, ever be the same because of what happened on this bridge. He looked at President Obama. If someone had told me when we were crossing this bridge that one day I would be back here introducing the first African-American president, I would have said you were crazy. The president rose and tightly embraced Lewis. He called the 75-year-old congressman from Georgia one of my heroes. Then he paid tribute to the Selma marchers. There are places and moments in America where this nation's destiny has been decided, the president said. Selma is such a place. In one afternoon 50 years ago, so much of our turbulent history, the stain of slavery and anguish of civil war, the yoke of segregation and tyranny of Jim Crow, the death of 4 little girls in Birmingham, and the dream of a Baptist preacher, all that history met on this bridge. After his speech, the president walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, hand in hand with Lewis and Amelia Boynton, a 103-year-old voting rights activist from Selma who had been beaten unconscious 50 years earlier. The children of Martin Luther King Jr. marched behind them. At the top, high above the Alabama River, Lewis grabbed a bullhorn and retold the story of Bloody Sunday. Lewis's return to Selma in 2015 should have been a triumphant occasion, a testament to the momentous progress achieved since 1965. Despite the many civil rights victories in the years since Bloody Sunday, however, the mood in Selma was more anxious. As Obama noted in his speech, the Voting Rights Act, quote, one of the crowning achievements of our democracy, now stood, quote, weakened, its future subject to political rancor. The president asked a question that many in Selma had been struggling to answer, quote, how can that be? And in a way, even though this was the end of my book, that question, well, it's the beginning of my book, but it was the end of my reporting on the book, that question is what I was asking myself when I began reporting on voting rights, because I did not grow up in the segregated South. I was not a child of the civil rights movement. My parents did not meet marching in Selma like other people I know. And the Voting Rights Act was something that, quite frankly, I took for granted, like a lot of people. I knew that there were these big struggles in the 1960s. I knew that we passed these landmark civil rights laws. But like a lot of people, I kind of thought this battle was over, that we had moved on to other things. And my come to Jesus moment was in early 2011, when so many state legislatures either flipped from blue to red or became a whole lot redder. And we began to see a wave of new measures introduced to make it harder for people to participate in the political process at every phase. Laws introduced to shut down voter registration drives and make it harder to register to vote, to cut back early voting and the time and ways people could access the ballot box, to require strict forms of government-issued ID that you had never needed to cast a ballot in any previous election, disenfranchising ex-felons, purging the voting rolls. All of this was happening at a rapid pace. There were 180 new voting restrictions introduced in 41 states from 2011 to 2012. And half the states in the country, including right here, passed new laws making it harder to vote. And this was a dramatic escalation of attempts to make it harder for certain people to participate in the political process. And it seemed a clear attempt after President Obama's election to make the electorate older, whiter, and more conservative, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive. And so I saw all these laws being passed, but no one was really writing about them. So I wrote a story for Rolling Stone with the provocative title of The GOP War on Voting. You gotta get people to pay attention in a magazine where they're used to reading about Katy Perry instead. And this really became an issue that I became very passionate about when I saw what was happening. And I thought I would write one story about voting rights and then maybe move on to covering American politics in general. But new restrictions were passed in new states. Many of these laws were challenged. There were major mobilization efforts against these laws in places like Ohio and Florida. And so I covered the issue of voting rights all the way through the 2012 election and became one of the few journalists to really focus on this issue. And then after the 2012 election, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act, to the part of the law that said that those states with the longest histories of voting discrimination have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And it was at that point in time that I became very interested in the history of the Voting Rights Act. And I began asking all of the lawyers and voting rights experts I knew, what should I read to get up to speed on what the Voting Rights Act did? And I was very surprised that no one had written a comprehensive account of what happened after 1965, that there had been so much written about Selma and the events that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but there had been so little written about the 5 decades that happened after. And so I wanted to write this book because I knew that the voting rights struggle did not end in that bridge in Selma in 1965, that there were 5 decades of history, and that we're not only celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act this year, but we're engaged in a whole new struggle over voting rights and who can and cannot participate. in our democracy. So I think that's why this work, to me, is so important right now. I want to just talk a little bit about what the Voting Rights Act did, because some people in this room will know it very well, and other people will be hearing about it possibly for the first time. The first thing the Voting Rights Act did was abolish the literacy tests and poll taxes and related devices that had disenfranchised black voters for so long in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Arkansas, etc., where to register to vote in Selma, for example, you had to name all 67 county judges to get on the voting rolls, something that the county judges themselves, I'm pretty confident, would not have been able to do. Then what happened is federal officials came to the South days after the passage of the Voting Rights Act to register voters in the most segregated parts of the South. And hundreds and then thousands of people were registered within days and weeks. Federal officials stayed in the South to make sure that elections were not stolen, that there would be free and fair elections in places like Selma, Alabama. And then what the Voting Rights Act said over a longer period of time was what I talked about earlier, that those states with the longest histories of voting discrimination would have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. This was so important because of the history of our country. We fought a civil war to end slavery. Federal troops occupied the South so that newly emancipated slaves could be able to gain access to the ballot. There was an unbelievable flourishing of black and white political power in the South, of multiracial government during this period of time. We had 22 black members of Congress elected from the South during this period. In Arkansas, there were 84 black members of the legislature during Reconstruction. But what happened was the federal government left. Federal troops pulled out of the South after the disputed election of 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes wanted the votes of Southern states. And we began to see things like poll taxes and literacy tests and all-white primaries and grandfather clauses and property requirements backed up by widespread violence and fraud and economic and social retribution. The last black legislator in Arkansas left in 1893. It would be 80 years before another black member of the legislature would be elected. 80 years. And so what the Voting Rights Act said was that we were not going to allow a situation where we were going to enfranchise, disenfranchise, re-enfranchise, and then let an entire segment of the population be disenfranchised again. As Lyndon Johnson said when he introduced the Voting Rights Act, it was wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your Americans the right to vote. So the Voting Rights Act said, if we want to be a democracy, we can't have a situation where people are disenfranchised across this country, and that we have to make the law as tough as possible so that states comply with it. So the Voting Rights Act was incredibly successful. And not only that, but it had to be reauthorized. Parts of it were temporary and had to be reauthorized by Congress. And it was reauthorized 4 times by the Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. And every time it was reauthorized, the law was expanded as well. So in 1970, when the law was reauthorized, 18-year-olds got the right to vote for all elections. That enfranchised 9 million new people. In 1975, when the law was reauthorized, protections were extended to language minority groups, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans, other Native peoples. States with a long history of discrimination against those groups, like Texas, also had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. What we saw is that while the Voting Rights Act was justifiably aimed at ending the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South, it quickly became the vehicle for expanding voting rights for all Americans. And it was something that touched every part of this country. And it laid the groundwork for a new South, so that people like Dale Bumpers and Jimmy Carter and eventually Bill Clinton could be elected. And they didn't have to appeal to the lowest common denominator when it came to things like race and civil rights. They didn't have to be another George Wallace, that there was another way forward in the South. And that's something that I think really transformed American politics. However, the debate about voting rights in this country is never settled. That's what you realize when you study American history. That in 1787, when the Constitution was ratified in Philadelphia, only white male property owners could vote. After the Civil War, black men could only vote freely in 5 states. In 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote, that was a right that was almost exclusively enjoyed by white women. And what the Voting Rights Act was supposed to do was it was supposed to end this debate about voting rights once and for all. And it accomplished the goal of enfranchising millions of new voters, but it didn't end the debate. And the reason why it didn't end the debate is because there's been a 50-year effort to try to roll back the gains of the Voting Rights Act. And my book is dedicated to telling two stories. The first story is one of revolution, how we got someone like John Lewis in the Congress, how we got President Obama as president, how we got offices across this country to become integrated for the first time. But it also tells the narrative of counter-revolution, how there's been a 50-year backlash to the Voting Rights Act, how we have a Supreme Court that has gutted the Voting Rights Act, how we have states all across the country that are now committed to making it harder for people to vote. And I think it's important to look at how that backlash has evolved over time. The first thing that states did, like South Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama, was they said that the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, that the federal government didn't have the power to set voter qualifications in the state. And the Supreme Court quickly said that the law was constitutional, that it was meant to enforce the 15th Amendment of 1870, which said very clearly, the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but then had been ignored for 95 years. That argument didn't work. So after the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act, states like Mississippi began to change their election laws so that newly registered black voters wouldn't be able to run for office and wouldn't be able to be elected and wouldn't be able to join with more moderate whites to have a coalition. And they did this either by gerrymandering political districts or by switching to countywide or citywide elections. So if you had a place like Jackson, Mississippi, which was 60% white and 40% black, if those 60% of white voters chose all of the candidates, then every elected office holder would remain white and very conservative, as opposed to reflecting the diversity of that place. That was also challenged before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that those kinds of voting changes were also unconstitutional, and that states like Mississippi had to approve their voting changes to make sure they wouldn't dilute the emerging minority vote. So then there was a new argument made against the Voting Rights Act. When we began to see people like Barbara Jordan and Andrew Young and John Lewis elected to the Congress, when we began to see places all around the country integrate for the first time in the 70s and 80s, the new argument against the Voting Rights Act was that if you drew a district that would allow an African American or a Hispanic or an Asian American to be elected for the first time, that would lead to affirmative action in the electoral politics, that it would be a form of quotas for political office, that it would lead to proportional representation. And this was an argument that was particularly made during the Reagan administration by people like John Roberts, now the future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I think Roberts is indicative of this counter-revolution to voting rights that I write about in my book. Roberts arrived in Washington as a young law clerk to Justice William Rehnquist. Justice Rehnquist was known as the Lone Ranger on the court because his views were so far out of the mainstream. And he kept a Lone Ranger figurine on his desk because he was proud of the label. Rehnquist believed that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided. He believed that all white primaries were constitutional. And he personally administered literacy tests to black and Hispanic voters when he was a Republican Party official in Arizona. So the fact that Roberts worked for Rehnquist was very eye-opening. And then Rehnquist became Roberts' entree to the Reagan Justice Department. And Reagan was someone who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And Reagan believed that the Voting Rights Act was humiliating to the South. He had a very, very different view of these laws than people like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton did. And so all of these young, ambitious, ideological conservatives come to Washington, like John Roberts, and they're making this argument that the Voting Rights Act is going to lead to affirmative action in the electoral sphere, and that it's benefiting one segment of society as opposed to everybody else. And this argument becomes incredibly influential. So when Justice Scalia in 2013 during the oral arguments in the Voting Rights case, says that the Voting Rights Act has led to a, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement. He is just stating in more blunt form the kind of things that John Roberts was arguing in the 1980s. And so you can draw a straight line from the activism of people like Roberts in the 1980s to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and realize that this has been a concerted effort for many years to change the court, to change the Congress, to change state legislatures, so that instead of moving forwards, we're moving backwards. Then we heard a new argument made against voting rights. We started to hear a lot about voter fraud. We started to hear a lot about this as the demographics of the country continued to change, and those growing demographics identified stronger and stronger with the Democratic Party. And the turning point in this story, I believe, is the election of 2000 in Florida. I'm sure many of you guys remember hanging chads and butterfly ballots and Katherine Harris. I'm probably giving Skip a heart attack just by mentioning this. And elderly Jews mistakenly voting for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach. But what was less well known about that election is that in the run-up to the 2000 election in Florida, there was a massive voter purge. And the state claimed that all of these ex-felons were illegally on the voting rolls. Florida was one of the states where ex-felons could not vote. And it was a ban that dated back to 1868, following the end of the Civil War. Many states had repealed these bans, but Florida had not. And there were two problems with this voter purge. The first was that it was inaccurate, that people were wrongly labeled as felons, even if middle names, last names, race, sex didn't perfectly match. The second problem was that it was discriminatory. African Americans were 11% of the electorate in Florida, but 44% of those on the voter purge list. So what happened on Election Day in Florida 2000 was that people showed up, they were wrongly told they were felons, and they were prevented from voting. After that disputed 2000 election, the NAACP sued Florida. And the state admitted that 12,000 people were wrongly labeled as felons and potentially prevented from voting. This was 22 times George W. Bush's 537 vote margin in that state. It changed American history forever. We got George W. Bush because of this. We got John Roberts as Chief Justice because of this. We got the Iraq War and a whole lot of other things because of this. And there were elements of the Republican Party that learned the unfortunate lesson that small manipulations in the electoral process could make a very big difference in close elections. And that talking about voter fraud, real or imagined, was the way to build support for these new restrictions. And so what happened was the groundwork was laid in Florida for what would come later following the election of President Obama. And this was driven by a fear of the changing electorate in 2008, which I chronicled in my first book, Herding Donkeys. There were 5 million new voters in 2008. Of those 5 million new voters, 2 million were African American, 2 million were Hispanic, and 600,000 of them were Asian. And they voted 75% for President Obama. And these were the fastest growing demographics in the country. So you have two options if you're the opposition party. You can reach out to these new constituencies by changing your policies to become more attractive, or you can make it harder for those that disagree with you to be able to participate in the process. And unfortunately, many, many people chose the latter. And that was a surprising development after the election of President Obama. I think many of us, myself included, were naive about what President Obama's election would bring in terms of ending these battles. Far from ending these battles, new barriers emerged anew following the president's election. And then we got a Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that said that those states with the longest histories of voting discrimination no longer have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. This has meant a few things in practice. It has meant that laws that were blocked as discriminatory, like Texas's voter ID law, have been allowed to go into effect. In Texas, 600,000 registered voters don't have a strict form of government-issued ID. And the law is written in such a way that you can vote with a handgun permit, but not a state university-issued ID. Moreover, you need underlying documents to get this ID, like a birth certificate. There are people in Texas who were born at home in the segregated South. They never even had a birth certificate. Same kind of problem you're going to see in a place like Arkansas. Then, a third of counties in Texas don't even have a DMV office. So if you have an expired driver's license or you don't drive, how are you supposed to get to an adjoining county in rural Texas in a state that has no public transportation? So these are some of the barriers associated with these kind of laws. And that's why this law was blocked initially, but it was allowed to go into effect after the Supreme Court's decision. It's subsequently been blocked again, but the state of Texas has spent $8 million defending it in court. And many, many people have been disenfranchised in the meantime. Then a month after the Supreme Court's decision, North Carolina passed a sweeping rewrite of its election system. North Carolina had the best election laws in the South. They cut early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. They required strict voter ID. They eliminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, which was taught in high school civics classes, so that people would be registered when they turned 18. They eliminated Citizens Awareness Month, which the state ran just to encourage people to register to vote. All of this in one bill a month after the Supreme Court's decision, when John Roberts said that voting discrimination was largely a thing of the past. Then you guys may have seen the headlines from Alabama more recently. Alabama passed a strict voter ID law in 2011. It was allowed to go into effect without federal approval following the Supreme Court's decision. Alabama just closed 31 DMV offices in the state, in all of the counties surrounding Selma, where people died fighting for voting rights in 1965. The state has just said it will reopen these DMVs for 1 day a month. You know how often voter registration offices were open in Alabama in 1965? 1 day a month. That's one way you restrict access to the ballot. Make it so inconvenient for people to participate that they just give up and they disengage. So these are the kind of things we're seeing as a result of the Supreme Court's decision. And the 2016 election is going to be the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, which means that crucial swing states like North Carolina and Wisconsin are going to have these laws in effect for the first time. We've seen in states like Arkansas that some of these things have been blocked, but in far too many places they're going through, and it's become much harder to stop them. But I don't want to just have all you guys leave at noon on this beautiful day all depressed. So I do want to talk about some solutions, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel here. In 1993, President Clinton signed a law called the National Voter Registration Act. What it said was that citizens had an opportunity and a responsibility and a requirement to be able to register to vote at DMVs and other government agencies. Because what happened is there was a big gap in enfranchisement after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. In Arkansas, for example, the number of registered voters jumped from number of black registered voters jumped from 17% in 1947 to 94% in 1976. Unbelievable advancements. But there were many places in which there were still gaps in registration. There were still people that were disconnected from the political process. And the idea was to make it easier for them to register. And in the first years after the passage of the National Voter Registration Act, 30 million people registered for the first time or updated their registration at places like DMV and other government agencies. Now there is an effort to expand this law to automatically register people to vote, automatically register US citizens to vote in places like Oregon and California. So if you interact with the DMV and you're a US citizen, you will be automatically registered to vote, and then you can opt out. I think this is interesting for two reasons. The first is that in Oregon, it's going to add 300,000 new voters to the rolls. In California, it could add 6 million new voters to the rolls, which is potentially transformative. But it's also a different way about thinking about voting rights. It's a way of thinking about voting as a right, not a privilege, which we've done so often in our society, and treating it as a fundamental right. Not just paying lip service to voting as a fundamental right, but treating it as a fundamental right, and saying that as a country, we have a responsibility to make sure that more people participate, and that we're better off when more people do so in a democracy. You think that would be a settled truism right now. You'd think that laws like the Voting Rights Act would be settled, would be uncontested. But what we learned throughout American history is that the most fundamental right is also the most contested, because political power is what's at stake. And so when people say, well, what's the power of the vote? Why does the vote matter? What I say is, if the vote didn't matter, people wouldn't be trying to take it away. So I will end there and leave time for questions. Thank you.
Maybe the best voter education lesson that I've ever heard. So, questions? You've got a chance here to talk to someone who knows his stuff. Any questions? Well, this is some woman who knows her stuff.
Thank you. I am really intrigued by, and I've talked to the folks from Washington about the automatic voting.
Yeah.
Automatic registration, rather. And one of the issues that's come up regarding that we have to think about is there's an immigration connection to it. So would you talk about that and how we should be thinking about, because I'd love to do it here, but there is a guard that we need to kind of keep up?
Yeah. So in California, undocumented immigrants can get driver's licenses. So that was an argument against doing this. However, they're given a different set of driver's licenses. They're not giving the same driver's license. There's a special category of licenses for undocumented immigrants. So they're already screening who isn't and is not a citizen. And they're not going to automatically register those people that are getting that kind of license. So there's built-in safeguards in the system. Now, we obviously have to see how this is going to play out in the implementation. The implementation of this is very important. But there's a way to do it without registering undocumented immigrants and other non-citizens. And I think it's both a legitimate concern, but I also think that this is something of potentially a straw man argument that's been used against it in California. And we've heard a lot of rhetoric about undocumented immigrants. These new restrictions aren't just aimed at African Americans or one segment of the society. A lot of them have been aimed at the growing Hispanic community as well. And there's been a lot of rhetoric about undocumented immigrants registering to vote and voting in US elections, which makes no logical sense because it's already a felony to do so, and presumably they're here to work and they do not want to be deported. But I think it's going to be an issue that's worked out in Oregon and California. And my feeling is if it works successfully in those states, then it's going to spread elsewhere. Arkansas might not be the third state to do it, but it may be coming eventually.
Bob Nash, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Do you have any prediction about what might happen in the redistricting that's going to occur, I guess, in about 5 or 6 years as it relates to particularly southern states?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that southern states had to do was they had to approve all of their redistricting plans with the federal government, those that were covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and there were many, many fights over this in the decades after the Voting Rights Act. Texas, for example, had every redistricting plan since 1970 blocked by the federal government, each redistricting cycle. Now it's going to be interesting to see what happens because they don't have to approve those maps anymore, places like Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi. But they've also sort of turned the Voting Rights Act on its head. Because what they've done is they've taken existing majority-minority districts, so a district that's already 55% or 60% African American that was already electing someone like John Lewis or Jim Clyburn, and they've made them even more African American. So they've taken the percentages from 60% to 70% to pack these voters in so that the rest of the districts are whiter and more conservative, and the Democrats who serve in Congress or the state legislatures are more isolated. And I think the goal in the South is to turn the Republican Party into the white party and the Democratic Party into the black party. That has been said explicitly in places like Alabama and Mississippi, as opposed to the party that we remember in the 1970s in a place like Arkansas, which was multiracial, and there was coalitions of blacks and whites working together. So in some ways, it's in their interest not to tamper with these maps, but we also don't know what will happen. If at some point it becomes politically advantageous to dismantle these districts or to move them around, they will have more opportunity to do so. And I think it's important to point out that Republicans didn't just win one election in 2010, they won a decade of elections. by being able to gerrymander so many of these maps. And I think that while the 2016 election is obviously going to be critical, the 2020 election might even be more critical, given that these maps are going to be redrawn again, and given that there's going to be another real big shift in terms of their demographics, and many states gaining new populations. And the question is, will those new populations be adequately represented, or will the maps be gerrymandered to once again dilute the influence of these fast-growing demographic groups?
Hi, my name is Emily Kearns, member of Class 11. I had a question about millennials. What are your observations about how millennials feel about the Voting Rights Act, and do you see any differences between how minority millennials feel about the Voting Rights Act versus members of the majority party?
Well, I think many millennials aren't even aware that there is a Voting Rights Act, unfortunately. And it was interesting because I was nearly done with my book when Selma came out. And so I watched the reaction to it, and what I realized is that many young people didn't even know about Bloody Sunday. They didn't even know it occurred. They didn't realize it was only 50 years ago. They didn't realize it took place in Alabama. They didn't realize that someone like John Lewis was brutally beaten and walks around every day bearing those scars. And what I realized is if they didn't even know about Selma, which has been extensively documented, then they certainly don't know about the Voting Rights Act and all of the struggles that happened after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So I think it's been critically important to try to educate a new generation. That Selma was so important in that way. I'm talking at a lot of college campuses in an effort to spread the word about this. I think it's important that the Voting Rights Act and voting in general connects to other issues that young people care about, particularly with Black Lives Matter getting a lot of attention. There's 5.85 million people that can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement laws, including 2.2 million African Americans. This is a huge issue all across the country, and it directly relates to the problem of mass incarceration. Not only that, but so many other issues that young people care about is impacted by voting. Climate change, access to health care, a woman's right to choose, LGBT rights. All of these things are connected to voting. Voting won't solve all of these problems, but it's the first step to trying to solve these problems and to getting representatives that will be responsive to these issues. I think that minority millennials might be more aware of it than white millennials, but I think there's a collective lack of knowledge among all millennials of this issue. And what I would like to see more broadly is efforts to make it easier for those people to participate in the political process. Vermont just became the 26th state to adopt online voter registration. That means that 24 states don't even have online voter registration. In this day and age when we can do everything on an iPhone, we can't register to vote on one in many states. Places that have same-day voter registration, that's incredibly helpful in getting young people to the polls. The ability to show up, register, and vote on the same day. Many young people don't pay attention to an election until it's 20 days out. You can probably attest to that, Joyce. If you have same-day voter registration, you can at least get them at the last minute and get them to the polls. It was instrumental in Barack Obama winning North Carolina in 2008, for example. States that have same-day voter registration have turnouts up to 10% higher than states that don't. And this is broadly popular. When Scott Walker tried to eliminate same-day voter registration in Wisconsin, it turned out that his own son had used it in the last election.
Any other questions? Yes, Abby.
Thank you. Is it on? I'm Abby Olivier, a Clinton School alum, and now work here. Last week, I attended a presentation from by a demographer who was talking about changing demographics in our country. I learned that of all the people migrating in our country, 50% are migrating to the south, about 20% or 30% going west, and then the rest is dispersed. And I didn't know so many people were migrating to the south, and I was encouraged to think about the implications of that, and I did not think about the implications of voting. So, and now after your presentation, I am thinking about the 50% of people who are migrating, if they're coming to the South, are they going to be able to vote? Are they going to have easy access to vote? So I don't know if you can speak on that, and generally what you think voter turnout in 2016 will look like.
So if you look at a recent study by the Center for American Progress, rating the states by their voter access, the southern states, by and large, all come in last. They're getting Fs to Cs and Ds in terms of their voter access. They're not making it easy for people to participate by design, in my view, because of those changing demographics. The South is critical because it's shaped for so many years the politics of this country. It shaped it during the Civil War. It shaped it after the Civil War. It shaped it in 1965, and it's shaping it today. Not just because of the changing demographics, but because there's been a broad Southernization of the Republican Party. And what has occurred is this incredible gap where one party is largely white and largely rural, and the other party is very diverse and very urban in terms of its orientation. And that's one of the reasons why we're so far apart on so many issues. That's one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton is talking about 20 days of early voting and automatic voter registration and restoring the Voting Rights Act and re-enfranchising ex-felons, while the Republicans aren't saying anything. And if they are saying something, it's usually not good when it comes to voting rights and civil rights. And so I think that the changing demographics are key. I think voter turnout is going to be an extremely important issue for both parties, but I think particularly for the Democrats. What we've seen is that when a lot of people turn out, Democratic candidates tend to do better. That's what happened in 2008 and 2012. When fewer people turn out, Republicans do a lot better. That's what occurred in 2010 and 2014. And so Hillary is going to need a huge turnout from these changing demographics, or whoever the Democratic nominee is going to need a huge turnout from these changing demographics. And I'm trying to do two sort of contradictory things. I'm trying to call out people that are doing this and name them so we don't beat around the bush, because I think it's important they feel some heat for doing something that's so profoundly anti-democratic. But I'm also trying to say that there's a long history of bipartisan support for the Voting Rights Act, that there were many members of both parties that have supported this law, that stood up to people in their own party to support it, and that there's a long tradition of bipartisan support for the Voting Rights Act. And that's something that we have to get back to. We can't be naive that it's going to happen anytime soon, but it is possible. And so I'm hoping that in some way we can start making some progress in a bipartisan, non-ideological way on this.
And back here at the back.
Hi, my name's Ann Haley. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. So as someone who's at the top end of that millennial generation, I was shocked to hear some of the details of what you're talking about. You told us, but I do know about the Voting Rights Act. But I recognize that a lot of the folks younger than me don't know some of these crucial parts of our past.
Yeah.
And obviously a lot of that ties to education.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the lack of education, especially in the South, about the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
and then civics in general has impacted this situation.
Yeah. It's a really good question. There's a new textbook in Texas that basically treats slavery as a good thing because it brought new goods and workers to the South. This is a huge problem. An entire segment of the population is being taught one version of history. And this was really reinforced to me when I spent some time in Selma recently, looking at it now. And the schools have completely resegregated. And the white students there go to private schools and they celebrate Jefferson Davis Day instead of Martin Luther King Day. And the black students are on the other side of the railroad tracks, literally. And they're in failing schools. And they're not getting nearly the same level of resources or education. And this is a problem that's magnified all across the South, but it's just the fact that this occurs in Selma was particularly eye-opening. So I think it's really important that this history be taught, that Selma be watched not just by people who know about Selma, but people who don't know about it. And that's why it's also, I think, so important to tell the history since 1965. Because when I went to Selma and to other parts of Alabama with all of these members of Congress, it was clear that some of them did not get it. That 20 Republican members of Congress made the trip, and only one of them came back and supported legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act. I think they were just there for the photo op. They just wanted their picture taken with John Lewis. They didn't want to actually do anything. And Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who was one of the co-chairs, said that we needed to decouple Selma from the Voting Rights Act. As long as that's the view, we're not going to make a whole lot of progress. So what I've tried to say is that we've made a tremendous amount of progress since 1965, but there are a tremendous amount of barriers that still exist. And you can't talk about 1965 without recognizing what's occurring in 2015. And we got to get that message across, and we got to talk about what's happening in places like Texas and North Carolina and Arkansas and Alabama, and how it connects to people's lives. That the fight about voting rights isn't an abstract fight. We're not doing this just so people can have the right to vote. We're doing this so people can have the political power to change their circumstances, to change their representation, to have a government that's more reflective of the citizenry. That's what it was about in 1965, and that's what it remains about today.
What would you say to people in this room who are here because they care about this issue, and those in other rooms where you go? What would you say that we ought to be doing to fight against these voter suppression laws and rules in politics?
Yeah, I would say keep fighting. I think that, it's important to fight the bad laws that are out there, and then to help the people that are most impacted. A lot of the people that are going to be most impacted by these restrictions are already disconnected from the political process in some form or another. So it's going to take work to make sure that they have the right ID, or they know when they can register, or they know how long of a time they have to cast a ballot, and they can comply with the law. In 2014, a lot of people were disenfranchised in North Carolina because they didn't know that same-day voter registration had been eliminated, that they could no longer show up and register, or they could no longer show up and change their address if they had moved. And so a major education campaign around that would have helped a lot. It was hard to do because these restrictions were passed last minute and people were confused, and it was a tumultuous election. But nonetheless, I think that reaching out to these people that are most impacted is really important. And then I think it's also important to lay out an alternative vision, that automatic registration, same-day registration, these kind of things are not just going to pass immediately in certain states. But what I learned is that John Roberts had a vision. He had a 30-year vision of what he wanted to do to the Voting Rights Act. And when he got in power, he did something about it. And those people that want to expand voting rights have to have the same vision. That for too long, everyone was playing defense, and everyone took things like the Voting Rights Act for granted. And you had a whole bunch of lawyers that knew how to sue people, and you had a whole bunch of lobbyists that knew how to work in Congress. But you really didn't have an alternative vision of how to bring more people into the political process. So one of the things that's occurred is that as more states restrict voting rights, other states are trying to expand voting rights and are trying to get more serious about it. And I think it's important, like Hillary's doing, like Bernie is doing, to lay out that alternative vision so that it may not happen this election, but at least the groundwork is laid for it to happen in the future.
You can.
Last session, I introduced the bill because I do kind of have a vision about the kind of things we need to do, and it won't happen all at once. I introduced the bill to allow pre-registration of 16-year-olds. And the very first thing, which seems not ridiculous in these days, oh, no, we can't do that because we don't have the technology. We might not, but then my next thing is going to be, okay, we're getting the technology, if that's your only excuse.
Yeah.
But the major thing I just want us to remember is, because this thing does have a color to it, it is absolutely crucial that black and brown faces not be the only picture of working for these changes, because it just exacerbates that whole thing. It's just about those people. It is essential that there is a big white spot out there working for this. And that's true of all the things that we've done to ourselves and resegregated ourselves. White people have to be front and center along with everybody else, because we know who marginalized people are. Let's don't pretend we don't.
Well, we've heard some powerful words today, some great questions. Everybody needs to read this book. We need to share it with our friends and colleagues. For those that teach courses in social change, this ought to be a required reading. Let's thank Ari Berman for coming to the country.
Can I say one more thing? I just want to say quickly, well, I'm signing books over there, but also I want to stay engaged with all of you guys. So if you have stories about this, please email me. My email is just Ari, A-R-I, @thenation.com. And I'm also going to be talking about this issue all the way through the election. So if you're with the League of Women Voters, or if you're with the NAACP, or with these groups and you're working on the issue and you want me to come speak, also talk to me about that, because I'm doing that with a lot of different groups. Thank you.